the Lord challenged me and said, there's a whole other pocket that you haven't turned over to me, and it's your investment portfolio. And I was living didn't know it at the time, but I was living under the two-pocket mentality that we call now, where you make as much over in one pocket, your investment portfolio, so that you can give enough away, give more away in your charitable bucket. Again, through this community, I learned that the Lord wants it all, and he's the best steward, the best manager, the best boss, and he really needs to be consulted and over our investment portfolio.
Well, hello there, and welcome back to the Generosity Now podcast, where we bring you inspiring stories of generosity and whole life stewardship. My name's Jonathan Collier, and I'm the podcast producer here on the Generosity Now podcast, and I have the opportunity to fill in for Eric and Laurie while they're taking some time off this summer and preparing for an exciting fall launch of Season 3 of the podcast. So in the coming weeks, as you're spending time with your families this summer, we wanted to bring some of our earlier episodes in Season 2 back to the forefront. We've got some great stories lined up. Whether you've heard these before or you're a brand new listener and you're just now discovering the Generosity Now podcast, we hope that these conversations will inspire you to live a life of generosity now and to dive deeper into the meanings of whole life stewardship. As always, we hope you enjoy this episode and the ones to follow, and be sure to stick around to the end. Now, on to today's podcast.
In today's episode, we have the privilege of introducing you to Dana Wichterman. Dana is a senior advisor with the Impact Foundation. Dana's calling is to build community around ideas. And the idea she is most excited about is impact investing that achieves multiple bottom lines: financial, economic, social, environmental, and spiritual. Dana has a master's degree in international economic development from Columbia University. For 20 years, she's worked for the U.S. Agency for International Development and the International Trade Administration, managing a large team and directing millions of dollars in foreign aid. In addition to co-founding the Washington, D.C. chapter of the Faith-Driven Entrepreneur and Investor, Dana facilitates small groups for generous giving, faith-driven investor, and women doing well, and serves on Talented, Noble Story Company, and 5 Talents boards. Dana lives in the greater Washington, D.C. area with her husband, Bill, and they have 3 grown children. Dana, thank you so much for being with us. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Dana, I would just like to have you start out and tell us a little bit about yourself. Give our listeners an introduction to you and your story.
Yeah, sure. I grew up in Colorado, so some of your listeners may be interested in that. And I have a deep love for the state of Colorado and for the West. And some of my favorite memories of growing up are horseback riding along the Highline Canal for hours when I was a kid, exploring in just beautiful areas, and also taught skiing at the Winter Park handicap program. And I taught blind people how to ski. So that was a really, really great experience. And learning to be generous with my time. And because I actually remember the first time I was terrified of what who God was having me teach to ski. I was like, Lord, please, no, not that one. He's the hardest one. And who did I get? That one, Richard, which then he was actually so handicapped that we had 2 of us helping him. But it became a beautiful relationship. I've known him for years, and really, really a great experience.
How wonderful. I love horseback riding here in Colorado. I don't get to do it very often, but it just feels so natural, and to be able to get farther out in the wilderness is just beautiful.
Yeah, how did you and Bill meet?
We met at church, and I had just come back from 1 year of grad school in India, and he had just come back from being a missionary to Turkish guest workers in Germany. So he was learning Turkish and having his missionary experience with OM. So we both were in countries where women were not supposed to look at men in the eyes. So we came back, met at church, and we're both trying to have conversations without looking at each other in the eyes and realizing, wait, this is a different culture. We can look at each other. And just met when I had first come to D.C. and got married 2 years later and have stayed in D.C. all along.
That's awesome. Dana, we first met at a generous giving event a few years back, and our paths have crossed multiple times since. On the Generosity Now podcast, we talk a lot about generosity and whole life stewardship. Would you share a bit of your own journey as it relates to generosity and stewardship?
Sure. So I think that generosity is one of the gateways that God has used to help me become more like Christ. And I know he can use all kinds of gateways, but I do believe that was the one when I look back over my life, that he has used the most. And what I would say was, when Bill and I were first married, I would have checked the box. I'm a good steward because I have gone through the Larry Burkett Crown Financial Program. We both agree, Bill and I, that the biblical foundations are you give 10% or more, save 10% or more, avoid debt when you can, and live frugally. And I was like, okay, I've got that. Check, good steward. And then because we tithe, I thought that's generosity, and it is, but I realized it was only the beginning of the journey he was taking me on. And what I also realized is that you all talk about whole life stewardship, that there were all kinds of other areas besides money that you need to steward and manage and be generous. And Bill and I have always been really generous with our time. So that's one area where we don't struggle. My husband, is extremely generous. I would say almost to a fault, where I had to rein him in sometimes. But there were, when we first got married, we had that framework. Then he had heard the story of Wichterman, a guy who had done a graduated tithe and increased his giving by 1% every year until he got to 99% or something. And my husband had this great, joyful grin on his face, and he said, wouldn't this be the most wonderful thing to lean into? And in my heart, I'm calculating how long I should live before I need to die if we do this, because that's going to be living in abject poverty. And, so my scarcity mentality just kicked in right away. So that was really my heart, was like, what? And as the Holy Spirit does, he introduces you to things and you kind of works on you. And I said, okay, well, I'm not sure about the 99% thing, but let's talk once a year and see if we can increase by 1%. But I reserve the right to both go back to the 10% if I feel like we need to, and change it around. So, and Bill's always been really gracious about that. So what happened was we started learning that there is a different way to be generous, where you don't have to even, at first we thought in terms of percentages, but then it was more in terms of lifestyle choices and things we could do with that extra tithe. And so I'll tell you another inflection point in terms of where God taught me to be generous. My dad had run a foundation, the Buell Foundation in Colorado. And so growing up, I thought, that is the most fun job anyone could ever have. It's like a fairy godmother. You get to go around and make people's dreams come true and have impact. And you have an endowment that keeps growing resources, so that you have the goose that lays the golden egg. You can keep being generous. So when I was researching all that and learning how to do that in my job at AID, because I was looking at the Ford Foundation and how they use their endowment also not only doing well, but doing good. I came home to Bill and I said, how about we set up one? It'll be a play, like a kids play foundation. We'll put aside the 1% of our tithe in a checking account. We'll call it God's Fund, and I'll try to grow it. It'll take years because we had a very tight budget, but we'll try to grow that to $10,000. Once we've hit $10,000, we will then, whatever interest or income comes in, we as a family will determine where that money goes. And so we decided to do that, and we made jokes about how if we touch that checking account that calls God's Fund and we touch it for anything other than giving, may God strike us with lightning, those kind of, jokes that we Bill and I have a sense of humor that way. And so it grew over the years two ways. One, because we lived the Crown financial principles and worked hard, we were able to grow our income, but we were also had a inheritance from my father that really brought us into thinking, oh, wealth can be dangerous. We need to seek counsel. People right away told us we need to go to generous giving and some other of the generosity community. And so that's really what seeded our foundation to become less of a fake foundation, which is what my kids called it, to a real foundation. And this is where NCF comes in. National Christian Foundation was the first institution we heard of to say, that is where you need to move your foundation. So we never had to set up a real foundation. We set it right up under NCF and have learned wonderful community, all the tools, all the techniques that you need to know to be a more effective giver and a more joyful giver.
Dana, that story is just amazing. And I know I relate to some of it because we do, I think, also in our journey, and I think you touched upon this, is as we grow as individuals and even just get older in time, we do experience different pieces of that generosity story. And that joy that we have from giving actually grows our desire and it grows our closeness with God. You talked a lot about the generosity side. Did you see your faith growing in that same space a lot?
Yes, because I feel that I had to wrestle with God each time I was challenged by new ways to be generous, because he would reveal new parts of my heart that I was acting out of duty and obedience, which is your first step. But the real step is to get to where it's natural. It's a part of your DNA, and you actually enjoy obeying the Lord. And I would have to say that there's been times it's taken 2 years to 7 years in some of these areas where I look back and see the Lord really working on me. And I can say that at first, there was a lot of grumbling in my heart and a lot of, okay, we'll do this, and then moving to where, wow, why did I ever think that was hard? And now his burden is easy and light, and it is joyful, and it makes sense, whereas before it didn't quite make sense.
I'm right there with you, sister. I identify with all of that.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that there have been multiple significant inflection points in your journey that created this significant growth. You talked about the impact of generous giving and that help in your journey. I'm wondering if you'd flesh out any more of those significant inflection points. Listeners really, really, I think, appreciate and grow when they hear from other stories as well.
Yeah, well, I would say, again, the main inflection point was when we got the inheritance from my father, and I felt destabilized. My husband just felt joyful, and I felt like, okay, what do we do now? How do we live? What choices do we make? And it was in community, in the NCF, Generous Giving, and those groups that I learned how to navigate this in a way that wouldn't spoil our kids, that would not spoil us, because I think God warns so much of the dangers of idolizing wealth. And I've always been concerned about the materialism in the West and in Western Christianity. And so really have been around in this generosity community, have really been around people who have walked it out. They're way more mature than me. They're way more creative. Basically everything I do, I just copy someone else. And I just love it, because I see people co-creating with God, living out their purpose and their calling, and those works that, in Ephesians said, those good works that God set out for us to do before we're even born. And I see people living into those so joyfully, so much fun, so relationally, with their resources, time, talent, treasure, ties, testimony, everything.
I really appreciate you sharing all of that. And your involvement, though, is also with impact investing. Can you dig into that a little bit and how you got involved and started down that road of impact investing in that stewardship place?
Sure. Well, that would be another inflection point, because about 6-7 years ago, the Lord challenged me and said, there's a whole other pocket that you haven't turned over to me, and it's your investment portfolio. And I was living didn't know it at the time, but I was living under the two-pocket mentality that we call now, where you make as much over in one pocket, your investment portfolio, so that you can give enough away, give more away in your charitable bucket. And through this community, I learned that the Lord wants it all, and he's the best steward, the best manager, the best boss, and he really needs to be consulted and over our investment portfolio. Both our endowment within National Christian Foundation, but also our personal finances. For the first year that I was, again, my husband was all ready to, let's get a financial kingdom advisor and let's go for it. And I'm like, I think I can figure this out on my own. And I kind of did the Jonah thing. Like, yeah, I'm going to run away from this. Then we got the financial advisor. I said, okay, I'll just listen. But and I was like, that cognitively makes sense. That, and then it started to, the Holy Spirit again worked on me to where it's like, that really makes sense. We do not want any ill-gotten gain at all. In fact, why would God want me to offer charity to, charitable money to him that was ill-gotten? No, that doesn't make sense. So through that, we have been going through now our entire portfolio, making it at least with the negative screen out what the Lord would not be honored by. And then, even more exciting, putting the positive screens in. What kind of investments might God love to see? What kind of flourishing can these businesses that we're investing in contribute to the world? What kind of shalom? And so that's how I was introduced to impact investing. And your sister organization, Impact Foundation, with Amy Minnick and Jeff Johns, I started with them just this year and have loved being an advocate for, particularly for women, to get involved in impact investing as a way to live out joyfully and intentionally their calling with all of their resources.
That's great. We talk a decent amount about impact investing here on the Generosity Now podcast. If you are just joining in and you're not very familiar with it, one, we did a podcast, I think it was in the early numbers, 4 or 5, on what is impact investing. But Dana, would love to even hear just from your own voice. Would you give it just a description of impact investing? And then would love to hear, there are, through Impact Foundation, what are just some projects or things that you're really encouraged by, or some stories where people can start maybe putting some meat on the bones as it relates to, okay, I've been hearing more about Impact Foundation, but like, what could these be and what could they look like?
Yes. So for me, impact investing is using there's 2 ways. You can use your charitable capital through Impact Foundation to set up your own donor advised fund. And instead of investing in a charity, you're investing in a transformational business that has multiple bottom lines. You can have spiritual impact, economic impact, social, environmental. And you're doing it with equity or debt. So it's as if you're creating that recyclable capital, because when those companies can pay you back their debt or they have an exit and you have equity, it goes back into your donor advised fund and you get to redeploy it again. And so I really see NCF and Impact Foundation as just all part of the ecosystem of harmonizing how you do your charitable impact work and your kingdom work, really. But we also do impact investing out of our personal capital as well. It'll have a little bit different risk reward profile, but really trying to turn over even that mentality to the Lord of what are wise stewardship principles all along the way of market rate return, concessional return, to straight donations and charity. And it's all now thinking about harmonizing that. I was going to say some examples of impact investing that have been really joyful. One is through a fund in Africa called Talenton, and they are trying to do something that I think my work at USAID was never able to really achieve, which is poverty alleviation through market-based approaches. And so what they are trying to prove is that, and show, is that if you invest capital in the right companies in Africa, they can grow, they can change, they can contribute to flourishing in their country in a sustainable way, so that over time they'll draw others into that ecosystem, and you can actually transform cities and nations through this approach, through poverty alleviation. So that's one example. There's, in fact, come to our website. We've got all kinds of examples on our website of people really aligning their values with their charitable capital.
That's great. Yeah, we definitely big fans of Talenton. John Halverson recorded right here down in the basement of Laurie's a little while ago, and we'll be getting his published in the new year as well. And so, good big fans there. I also love how through the Impact Foundation you can also make more like direct investments. So that was like more of a pooled fund kind of option, but then there's also like direct investments that you're able to make using your charitable capital. And so, and those they are varied. There's coffee companies, there's coffee shops, there's movies, there's Christian movies, there's The Chosen. All of these are different avenues that folks are able to use their charitable capital and their private capital, personal capital, to make investments in these organizations.
Yes, and one that we made direct investment in was called Noble Story Co. And we, two guys that launched a company to really try to bring good, true, and beautiful entertainment into the culture in a way that is, I would say, faith adjacent, not faith based. And there's plenty of TV and movies that are being produced for the faith based community, and they're getting better. But we need to also battle it out in those faith adjacent sides. And so when I met Adam and Andrew through the Lion's Den, they were raising capital for their startup. And so I used my impact account, invested equity into their company. Then later on, when they needed debt, I also used my impact account to we negotiated the interest rate. And so I have both equity and debt in that company through my impact account. But what was really beautiful is they asked me to be on their advisory board, and they asked me to be their spiritual integration officer. I didn't know what that was. I said, okay, let's figure that out. So through the NCF community, I call people and say, how do you do this? How do you advise your companies to integrate spiritual principles throughout the entire business, not just in their hearts, but in their legal documents and how they treat employees, how they treat the suppliers. So that's been a really beautiful experience.
What an honor to be asked to have that position in this organization, and what a privilege it is that you get to mentor in that board role. You're very involved in a lot of things, Dana, and I love the leadership and all of the things that you do. What other things are you involved with today?
Sure. And so I left USAID about 20 years ago, but my heart is still in poverty alleviation around the globe. And I really believe now that it's going to be the marketplace where God is going to be, and his spirit is really going to be moving people to be 24/7 believers in the marketplace. And Jesus did a lot of his miracles in the marketplace, and I think he will continue to do a lot of those miracles in the marketplace. And I see that happening in the faith-driven entrepreneur and faith-driven investor community. And I see these people aligning their calling, their work with God's heart for his glory, for the good of others, and for their good, because they need an income. And there's nothing wrong with making an income, a good income. And they're doing it in a way that faith-driven investors can come alongside them. So kind of the builder and the backer, that a friend Donna Harris says, that you have these co-creators with God, which are the entrepreneurs that are taking so much of the risk. And then you have the funders, the backers, that you can, as an investor, come alongside these folks that are being so creative all around the globe. And so that, I would say, is one of my truest joys, is to see this movement of faith-driven entrepreneurs and investors being built out. So we started a local community in the DC area. We meet 6 times a year. We bring in faith-driven entrepreneurs to showcase what they're doing, and we think through what are the marks, what are the ways that you can live out in a Christ-like way, how to manage your capital when you're doing this kind of entrepreneurial investment journey. And then just serving on several boards of, like I said, Noble Story. I also serve on Talenton's board. But then I get a deeper insight into how this co-creating with God and solving global problems in God's way, with both the means and the ends, I get a deeper, richer sidecar to be a part of all that.
You know, it's interesting. I don't think I've thought through this yet enough until just listening to you, but it's really neat that through impact investing and having faith-driven investing as a focus of what you're doing now, you're also much more aligned with the organizations that you're actually invested in. So previously, I even think about in my own portfolio, I'm not connected to many of the companies that we're invested in, but here you've been asked to come in and be to lead in the spiritual formation of this organization and to be on the board of this organization, and you intimately know the stories of the investments and the impact that you're making. And so when we think about that whole life stewardship, as we kind of riffed off of the acronym LIFE, your labor, your influence, your finances, your expertise, you're able to integrate all of those things when you've kind of gone all in focusing on this faith-driven investing kind of world. So I think it's really beautiful.
Thank you. I just find so much joy in that. It's more holistic, and I get to feel like I'm a part of it, because God didn't make me an entrepreneur, and that's okay. And he didn't even make me that creative, but he allows me to come alongside creatives and be a part of their work.
I'm right there with you, Dana. I'm not the entrepreneur side. My partner here, Eric, is a great entrepreneur. He's wonderful. And I just see those, God created us differently. And we have just like you said, we can still be involved, but we don't all want to be the same purpose. And we get to do different parts of the puzzle in building these different organizations. And the impact investing and being involved in that is just, I love it. I came from a large charity, and I love seeing this different, where we can give people the opportunity to have those jobs, to be able to build their businesses and help that poverty alleviation in such a different way than just giving handouts. And I just think it's a beautiful way that we as believers have really progressed in this place of really being involved.
I agree. And in fact, I see Compassion International, your former organization, as doing that. They are not only working with children, which I love. We've had several Compassion children over the years, but they are working with then faith-driven entrepreneurs, and helping kids that have graduated out of the program to then find a footing in business and earn their own income. So it's not only a handout, but a hand up.
Dana, I actually just came back from one of the countries that Compassion worked in, had a privilege of attending a wedding there, and got to meet 4 individuals that had gone through the Compassion program as children, and also their leadership development program. And all 4 of these individuals are strong business owners. One works in government. And to see them and experience what they're doing today from all of this, they are helping their country in great ways. And it's fun to be able to also rejoice and to see the way that God is using them.
Dana, earlier you mentioned that you've learned a lot from others. And you actually are helping our listeners and helping us here as we learn. But I wonder if you'd share some helpful resources that you've had along your journey, organizations, books, podcasts, different things like that. What are there any that jump out that you'd say, hey, dig in with this?
Oh, yes, certainly. I get the weekly digest from National Christian Foundation, and I love it. Bill and I read it and then say, oh, what about that? So we get all kinds of ideas from that. So it's curated both stories, and you have a great library and of resources. So I've utilized that quite often. The Faith-Driven Entrepreneur and Investor website has so much content you couldn't even get through it all. The podcasts are phenomenal. I've been through many small groups, mostly on Zoom, some in person, but those are terrific because then you can meet like-minded people and actually talk through the content and struggling with how to do this well. I would recommend the Generous Giving website. And again, their videos are tremendous, and going through a jog, which is a journey of generosity. So those can be done in person or online, and I would say that was also an inflection point of going through a jog, which really helped Bill and I, again, because I think you have to talk about this a lot to make sure you're on the same page. And we haven't always been on the same page. And there are some things he gets more excited about than I do. There's core things that we've grown together and we're excited about giving or investing in those. But then there's the side pockets where he's excited about, I'm not. So we kind of have a little bit of a portion of all of that we leave to each other and say, okay, that's, you have a budget there. We budget everything. And the other thing I would say have learned is that partly because most of the way I have started with generosity is to feel guilty and, kind of, okay, live into the shoulds because this is what I'm supposed to do as a Christian, is that everybody's generosity journey looks different. Yours does not have to look like someone else's. And you can say no to things. If your name is not on it, if you've prayed about it and the Lord has shown you where your calling is, you can say no. You should say it gracefully and kindly. And I've had to learn that. I used to kind of ghost people when they'd ask because I'm like, oh, I feel guilty saying no. And it's like, no, do it in a God-honoring way. But we all get compassion fatigue now. 24/7 news shows us every pocket of every suffering around the world. And people need to know that Jesus is the Savior, not us. And we're supposed to just come alongside and do the good works that he has determined for us to do. So your yes is godly, but your no is godly.
That's a great word. And I think a lot of us really need to have that permission. And I think it's really important that we can really encourage each other in that space.
I was going to say also another learning I've had is that it takes time. So I hear people saying, I started out joyfully. As soon as I was generous, I was joyful. I'm like, yeah, that wasn't my experience. It has been Bill's, but not mine. And so I felt guilty again, what's wrong with me? And what I've seen now is that it took time. And as I obeyed and lived into it and developed kind of the exercise muscles, the generosity habits and muscles, then the joy came. So I would say for those of you who are feeling guilty by not feeling the joy that you're, quote, supposed to be feeling when you're generous, just wait. It will come. And then it'll come in fury and beauty. And I actually feel like I'm now in an enchanted garden where it's everywhere I look. It's beautiful. It's fun. There's wonderful plants and people, and it's like a playground. But that was not how it started.
So Dana, we talk a lot about generosity stories and different things here. Why are you convicted that it's important for us to share those stories?
Well, I think it's part of our testimony. And I think Christians too often only want to tell about how horrible they were and now here's where they are now. But they are very reticent to share about how God has transformed them into being more Christ-like because it looks boastful. And what I would say is, if you're giving God the glory and the honor in your heart and in your words, you need to tell those stories because it is the way that people learn how to do it better. And it draws people in. It's an invitation. And I have to say, probably everyone that's invited on this podcast feels like, this looks a little showy. I shouldn't do this. And that's okay. That's right. We should be checking our heart. But if God owns it all and it's not really ours anyway, then why shouldn't we be telling these stories of how he's transforming us in, more like Christ? And so this is where Bill and I have gotten most of our inspiration, is from people on your podcast, people in the NCF community. And we couldn't have done it without all of them telling their stories. So I think it's part of our witness.
It's so good. Yeah, the stewardship of story is vitally important. And I am grateful for folks like you who share their story. I've grown significantly through the stewardship of story. And as you say, is we're not pointing it to puff ourselves up, but it's to point to the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. We say yes and amen. So thank you.
I really appreciate that because I want to be more sanctified every day. And I do learn from others that are willing to be that vulnerable with me. So I really do appreciate that.
So we often talk in the Christian community about how we look different than non-believers. And so it's the whole thing of what is worldly, what is not. And I think generosity is one of those gateway virtues that can help you be less worldly and more like Christ, as we've said before. And it's because with our generosity, we get to show people what we're for rather than what we're against. Again, so often, part of our faith is denying and stepping away from what is not God-honoring. But in generosity, you get to step towards what is God-honoring. And I do believe that is one way you shine the light on the gospel and become less worldly.
Yeah, one of the pastors, I think I've shared this before, I heard him say, live in such a way that it demands an explanation. And I think that you hit the nail on the head, through our generosity. It demands an explanation. Why would you do that? Why would you be so generous? Why would you give me that? Or why would you support that? It's like you could go buy a bigger house if you didn't do that, right? And so living in such a way that it demands an explanation, I think, is a beautiful thing for sure.
So another inflection point that God told me along my generosity journey was that I was now doing better with my finances, but I wasn't doing well with my possessions or my home. I believed that I was supposed to be hospitable, and I acted in hospitality, but usually grudgingly, again, had trouble when people would use our things and break or scratch, or, furniture would get stressed, whatever. And there was one time when we were having a huge event and huge scratch. It was just like a terrible scratch in our wood floor. And the only thing I could think of was, and the Lord, this is totally from the Lord, because this is not how I think. He said, I want you to see that as a love scar. Mm-hmm. And I want you to reframe any damage that happens to your possessions because of generosity as love happens here. And it was just a really beautiful way for the Lord to say, stewardship doesn't always mean managing your resources so that they don't get damaged, which, of course makes sense. But what about managing your resources so that people get loved? And when people get loved, the world is messy. There's going to be brokenness, scratches, scars that you're going to come away with, but you can reframe those as beautiful scars, kind of like the scars on Christ's hands and feet. Mm. And again, that was Holy Spirit. Totally. I don't think that way.
I love that. And I probably have a little bit different approach, Dana. From some stories in my life, one of the things that makes me feel most loved is actually when people come into my home and just do things in our home. So I love inviting people in. there's a reason, in my story of why that is the case, but it is one of the ways that I feel most loved, is being able to open our home to others.
Wow, what a great episode. I want to thank you for tuning in and listening. If you're a returning listener, thank you for being along for the journey. If you're a new listener, we're glad you're here. Be sure to subscribe wherever you consume podcasts. You can even find us on YouTube. All of the information in today's show notes and links and resources mentioned will be listed below. And until next time, thank you, God bless, and we'll see you right back here on the Generosity Now podcast.